This is Final Voice TV. Today, we ask a simple question. Should we be bold as a people of a continent and say what we're experiencing now is climate crisis? Or should we remain cowards and call it climate change? Are we experiencing climate crisis or climate change? Let's look at our food productivity. Food production is on the low now. And research has shown that nations that produce cocoa, coffee in Africa may not be able to produce the same amount of cocoa in the next 50 years. Look at the cyclones in Madagascar, in East Africa. Look at the floods in South Africa, in East Africa, in West Africa, Ghana. All these things are being caused by climate crisis. Let's be bold for once and call it climate crisis and not climate change. Today, I have Mr. Mitchell in the studios. Welcome to the show, Mr. Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Charles.
If you're watching me now, what you can do now is to subscribe. Kindly subscribe. Like this video and share. And what is important is to join the discussion. What I expect of you is to join this discussion by leaving your comment in the comment section. Should we be bold as a people and say we're going through climate crisis and not climate change? I'm going for a break. When I return, Mr. Mitchell tells us more. Does he agree to my statement or not? All right, we are back. We look at my simple question. Do you agree with me that we need to be bold for once? I mean, the people of this planet, the entire planet, no matter where you're coming from, can we be bold for once and say that the world is going through climate crisis and not climate change? Because if it's climate change, then there's no problem. But when it is crisis, then we have a lot to do. We have a lot to improve upon.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Charles, for this very interesting look at the issue of climate in general. Actually, it brings me to look at it from a structural perspective. So, when we talk about climate change, there was a point where it was convenient to use this term climate change. Because at one point we actually had people who didn't believe that there was this change in the climate in the first place. So they were saying, no, it's not climate change as such. The world has always been through these ups and downs. So it was convenient then to use this term climate change. So change denotes something that is actually, maybe we would say, going gradually, right? And
change is constant.
And it's constant. So yeah, it's something that we actually see it, but because there was this other group of people who had this pressure that they didn't believe this. So we were kind of balancing, and then we used this term climate change. But then, when we look at the situation that we find ourselves in currently, this actually brings me to climate communication, where we now look into the issue of semantics, the issue of words and their uses. So when we look at for instance, we've just been through a COVID crisis, the COVID pandemic, right? So a crisis actually also, even the action that are actually taken also prove this to be a crisis, right? So we actually saw what the media did, right? So when you talked about COVID, immediately the images that came to our minds of people dying, right? And everyone, if you were told to wash your hands, you didn't think twice about washing your hands because the message was clear. Yeah. If you don't wash your hands, the virus will catch up with you and you'll be like what we are seeing on media. Yeah. Right? So the media really put into the minds of people like that fear that we have a crisis.
Yeah.
And everyone knew it was a crisis. And when you were told to stay indoors, you didn't think twice about staying indoors. You just stayed indoors. Whether you didn't have food, that was another matter. You just locked your door.
Like a curfew.
Yes, a curfew, and you stayed indoors. Now, we are talking about semantics. We are talking about the actions that people took when they were told that it is a crisis, right? So, that is the power of words. And it actually comes even to the action as well. Now, when we come back to this issue we are talking about climate change and climate crisis, so it has been very convenient to use this word climate change because it is neutral, because it is soft, it is acceptable with everyone. So if you are polluting and it's climate change, it's still fine. But now when we start to use the word crisis and you are the emitter, then the narration has to change.
Yeah.
Because now we need action. So what action did we take when we heard about climate change? We even put our projections. We are saying 2030, 2050, that is when we plan to be carbon neutral. That is when we plan to actually probably do away with fossil fuels, etc. So we have put it so far away, right? But if it was a crisis like what we saw with the COVID situation, what happened? Normally it takes us 7 years for us to have a vaccine developed and then put out to the people. But in a crisis, what happens? A vaccine is developed within 4 months. you are getting a jab.
Yeah, I'm getting.
And well, you might question that it's 4 months, but you are getting the jab. Because why? It is a crisis, right? So this is the same situation that we should also be having with the climate change thing. So we should actually, because we realize that there are some species which actually are affected by a degree in temperature increase, right? We know this. So we know that with every temperature increase, with 1 degree temperature increase, something is happening to our species, right? So with this knowledge, we then have even projections that we want a business as usual approach 8.5 RCP. That is what we are actually thinking about, right? Maybe we can maintain a business as usual approach. Or at the best, it looks like maybe we are not able to contain the temperatures below 2 degrees. But that is because our thinking is not in terms of it being what? A crisis. Because if it was a crisis, by now, we should be actually talking about a different story. We should have actually ramped up our renewable energy. We should have actually seen, coming to think of it, let's look at the small islands, for example.
I was about to ask you, sea levels are rising.
Yes.
Food production is on the low compared to some 30 years, 40 years ago. The small islands, developing nations, these nations or countries are the ones affected. I mean, they are the victims. Now, the question I want to ask, who is to blame for this climate crisis?
Right. The issue of climate crisis is connected to human activity. And it is connected to emissions of greenhouse gases. Right. So, we all know the consumption that we find in the various countries. The good thing it is the information, the data about this is actually available. That so such in such a country, their emission is so much. If this information was not available, I tell you, we would be really in a very difficult position. But the climate crisis has actually been connected to industrialization. And we know that countries like those in Africa are not industrialized. Most of our people are in agriculture. So their emissions are mostly from agriculture. And we know the majority of people actually do not have tractors.
So if I should get what you're saying, the climate crisis is not being caused by the small island states.
Yes.
It's not being caused by Africans.
Yes. I actually was building the case. So by this, I was now taking into aspect, if we talk about the various sectors where we would have the emissions coming from. So in Africa, we are saying most people use livestock for their power. And livestock do not emit these as much emissions as we find with tractors, for example, because they burn fossil fuels. So when we look in short, we now look at the industrialized countries where they have a lot of in steel factories, etc., which actually have a lot of emissions. So this is actually the places where the greenhouse gases have actually come up from, and it's mostly the industrial, the rich countries, as some people put it, and not the small island states.
Yeah. So let's be quick on this one. It's been COP21, COP22, COP3, COP10, you name it. The upcoming one, COP27. Let's even target COP28, COP29, 30 and what have you. What do you think should be discussed when it comes to compensation? Should compensation or the donation of money be based on humanitarian principles, or there should be some kind of stiff measures, like you are destroying something and therefore you are supposed to pay for it? That is not the same as, oh, okay, we know we are the big guys. We have the steel companies. We are causing the high emissions. But hey, we're going to make some donations to you, but not as compensation. You can't demand monies from us. We just sit down and say, oh, let's donate money to these countries because they are the ones affected. Do you think that is the way to go? Don't you think small island states, developing countries in Africa, in Asia, in Southern America, should demand what is theirs?
Right. The issue of compensation is actually a burning issue. It's actually a big topic. And I think it's also going to be a big topic in the coming COP27. So coming back to your question, where we look into this aspect, whether it should be sort of humanitarian or it should actually have sort of, let's say, a mechanism that is actually drawn. So it actually brings us back to this same question, the boldness. So I think the first country that I've learned is Denmark, which is actually talking about compensation. So the other countries are actually silent on this word compensation. They don't want to use this. But now we have to be bold. If you've caused something, you have to bear the repercussions of whatever you have caused. So this is where people are using the philosophy of avoidance. So no one really wants to own up to whatever they've actually caused. So my belief actually is we should actually be talking about a mechanism that is attached to the emissions that have been produced and those that are being produced. Because the moment that we do not attach them and we just leave it to, okay, I feel like we can give you 2 million, we can give you 20 million, and yet what is the emissions that have been done in that current year when they give the 2 million? So if there is no that equation, that mechanism, and it is just left to some rhetoric that a figure pulled out from nowhere whose source is actually like we don't know.
Yeah, so for a win-win situation, you think there should be some kind of indicators, mechanisms to determine how much the polluters should pay.
Exactly.
To victims, like the small island states, like the developing countries that suffer from these high emissions.
Because then that is when we can now actually say or realize we are talking about a crisis. As long as we are not talking about this, it is just something that is, change. We need to change. Yeah.
Can we be bold as a people and call it climate crisis and not climate change? I'm going for a break. When I return, Mr. Mitchell continues from there.
So coming back to this situation where we are talking about a crisis. So we look at the aspect of heat waves, for instance. So earlier on, the temperatures have been gradually increasing up to a point, let's say in 2003 here in Europe, people actually died because of heat. And I think you have seen this image of the warming stripes that are put sometimes, in the climate change discussions. So you actually find that of late, the temperatures keep increasing, and for some of the, maybe very few times, even here in Europe, they've actually experienced droughts. So this was something that they actually didn't believe would happen, that we would have a drought in the UK, we would have droughts here in Europe, up to a point where even fires are actually just starting because of the high temperatures that are prevailing. And that is not in Africa, this is in Europe. So this is a crisis. Or should it be a crisis because it is happening in Europe? Because then we have had these situations happening in Africa before. We are talking about a crisis. So we are saying in Africa, for example, we have cyclones. A cyclone that can hit a nation, and the damages are up to as much as 3 to 5 billion. And these are poor nations that have to recover from this. And the damage of these cyclones on the GDP is so much. And it actually takes years for them to recover. And now you combine the extreme weather events, you combine the COVID, you combine the recession that is actually now, and then you have a picture of the crisis that we are talking about. So when we say crisis, we actually mean that it is a crisis. And the behavior, the actions that we take should also show that it is a crisis. And it should actually reflect even in this mechanism that we have been talking about. It should come to your pocket. If it doesn't come to your pocket, then it is not a crisis. That is my view.
What has happened to the polluter pays all principle? If you pollute, you pay for that. Why can't we go this direction? Why can't we talk of compensation, strict compensation, and not humanitarian donation or money based on humanitarian principles? This is Final Voice TV. If you're watching us now, you can join this discussion by leaving your comment in the comment section. Say something. Let me hear from you. Like this video and share. And one thing you can do is you can help us build large audience by subscribing. Subscribe to this channel and let's have large audience and let's discuss topics like this on this channel. Final Voice TV. Going for a break. I'll be right back. And Mr. Mitchell will give his last submission about, can we be bold as a people and call it climate crisis and not climate change? I'll be back. We are about to end the show, but what's your last submission? Your last submission about climate crisis?
Right, so the final word that we want to put out with regards to the climate crisis is, first of all, let us accept we are in a crisis. And when you are in a crisis, you get into crisis mode. And so the crisis mode, we actually see that climate change is actually affecting all spheres of life. It affects even food production. And food production touches our health. So even the diseases also are affected by climate change. So climate change touches almost any part that you can actually think about this life. And so it is a crisis. And when you are in crisis mode, you should actually behave as if you are in a crisis and not use this language, climate change, that we've been using all this time. That mantra is now stale. It's now stale news. We are actually in a crisis. We should actually do the same as we did with the COVID scenario. We saw how people ran around to get the vaccines. We actually saw, a lot of action that was taken by even the United Nations to solve the problem. So this is the same mode of action that we should actually be.
That within 4 months, there was a vaccine out.
Exactly.
4 or 5 months. So we should treat climate crisis just as the big guys or the big nations treated COVID-19 pandemic. Climate crisis is affecting human health. It's affecting food production. It's causing cyclones in East Africa, in South America. It's affecting everything on this planet. Let's be bold for once and call it a climate crisis and not climate change. This is where we draw curtains on today's show. Thank you for coming on the show today. Thank you for your knowledge. We keep counting on you for anything that we want to know about climate change,
Thank you.
climate crisis, and everything. Thank you.